Hello everyone, and thank you for viewing this presentation. The title of my talk today is Distant Lands of Which We Know Little. The reason for this title will be explained a little further on, but for those of you I've not yet met, please let me introduce myself. My name is Peter Morris, and you know it feels kind of strange when I think about it, but I've been involved in disaster recovery in one form or another for close to 40 years. Firstly, by supporting disaster recovery exercises in an IT technical role. I then ended up organising and running the exercises, and this was followed by 20 plus years working in business continuity for UK national and international operations, and now I believe in the next iteration of business continuity, which is operational resilience. Currently, I work as a Group Operational Resilience Officer for AXA, which is a French multinational insurance company headquartered in Paris. But today, like the last 2 years, I'm working in my home in the UK. I've chaired the IBM's UK Business Continuity and Recovery Services user group and participated in the retail and insurance sector business continuity groups. As a side note, if there are any continuity or resilience groups local to you, I would really encourage you to consider joining them. I have found them to be a great source of information and shared experiences. And if nothing else, they confirm you are part of a large, diverse, global profession and not actually going mad. I'm thrilled you could join me. So what am I going to talk about? As I mentioned earlier, the title of this presentation is Distant Lands of Which We Know Little. This paraphrases a former UK Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. But in essence, I'm talking metaphorically about the things that we shy away from fully considering, or physically about real events having downstream consequences which impact our organisations in ways we didn't anticipate. Firstly, I'm going to make some personal observations on recent and impactful events, and then I'll look at what connections they have, and I'm going to explore how seemingly remote incidents can ripple into our lives, the possible consequences of these incidents, and finally, I'd like to share some new thinking with you, which may help you prepare for and deal with incidents when they arrive. In typical teacher format, I'll be posing a few questions along the way for you to consider. So let's get into some of these personal observations. Firstly, and yes, you knew it had to be here, pandemic. I'd like to think this is a subject which we all have had some experience in recently. And forgive me, because I'm going to labour on this point slightly. But I believe it is such a rich case study with some important messages emerging from the crisis, which are relevant to all of our organisations. So here's the thing, a brief history lesson. Communicable diseases of one form or another have been high on the World Health Organization risk list since its inception. In fact, even prior to the formation of the World Health Organization, when it was just the International Sanitary Conference, which convened, funnily enough, in Paris in 1851, they were there discussing the standardization of international quarantine regulations against the spread of cholera, plague, and yellow fever. However, more recently, we've had several of what I would call pandemic warnings. Bird flu, swine flu, severe acute respiratory syndrome, which you might know as SARS, and Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which you know as MERS. All of these are either infectious influenzas or coronavirus. I'm now going to ask you some of those questions. With COVID-19, did we really understand the signals? Wuhan was a long way away for some. Did we believe it would blow out like the other flus? And once we did realise what we were dealing with, what was our speed of reaction? For me, in the UK, our government seemed slow to start, but once awakened, like many other countries, It quickly implemented lockdown restrictions, and once available, it deployed a national vaccination response, and now with a booster program. This means that after 2 years, we're slowly awakening from our COVID nightmare. However, I feel the financial implications of this have yet to be fully realised. So now, we've had some time to reflect on our last 2 years. What did our 2018-19 pandemic plans look like? Did they account for what we experienced from 2020 onwards? What did your exercises tell you? In the UK, there were 2 national pandemic exercises held in 2016. The first, in February, was Operation Alice. It was commissioned by the UK National Health Service, and the scenario was a simulation of a large-scale outbreak of Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, MERS. The post-Alice exercise report noted that during the simulation, the level and use of personal protection equipment was central to the exercise dialogue, and that the pandemic stockpiles were suggested to ensure sufficient quantities would be available. Other suggested measures included point of entry screening to restrict the spread of virus from overseas, and for officials to draw up options plans with cost benefits for quarantine versus self-isolation for a range of contact types, including symptomatic, asymptomatic, and high-risk groups. Officials also recommended developing a plan for the process of community sampling and emphasised the need to develop a tool or a system to trace contacts of people who have been infected by the virus, suggesting a live database of contacts with classifications, current state, and other data relevant to the situation. Remember, this was 2016. In October of the same year, a second exercise, Cygnus, was run by Public Health England to estimate the impact of a hypothetical H2N2 influenza pandemic on the UK, named swan flu. The scenario placed the participants in the 7th week of a pandemic, effectively at the peak of the crisis, when there would be the greatest demand for healthcare. At this stage, an estimated 50% of the population had been infected, with close to 400,000 deaths. The hypothetical situation was that the vaccine had been made and purchased, but not yet delivered to the United Kingdom. The findings of this exercise fell into 4 categories. First was a need for centralised operation. Feedback showed that the organisations varied in preparedness, with some relying on corporate memory and others depending on outdated, missing or incomplete individual pandemic protocols. There were also demonstrations of silo planning between and within some organisations, which had different levels of detail and structure and which could not be corresponded well when used simultaneously. Second was the easing of regulations. There was a proposal to consider rolling back health sector legislation and regulatory restrictions. This was seen to aid management of essential services and meeting healthcare demands with fewer obstacles, especially when the situations were evolving quickly and decisions need to be made as soon as possible. Key suggestions were for rules to be more malleable and easily adapted to the circumstances at hand. Thirdly, a need to understand and manage public reaction. This represented something of a challenge to the exercise, as exercise Cygnus was centred around assumptions of public response which were yet to be validated. Expectations of how the public would react were based on the magnitude of swan flu. This was not considered to be entirely representative of what would have happened in real life. It was stated that moral decisions, such as those involving mass burials or population triage, may differ in the face of public reaction. It was recognised further work was required to understand public reaction, so it was factored into significant decisions and communication strategies developed, particularly for ethically charged scenarios. Finally, meeting the demand for services. A lack of resources and limited ability to increase supply in the face of demand was identified. This directly impacted on how emergency plans could be operated at a local level and led to the call of a revision of the central operating planning. Little tactical coordination was observed when the need for services outweighed the capacity for local responders. The need for more precise protocols was identified to guide healthcare providers at an operational level should there be a need to drastically step up local response. A suggestion was to implement planning at a regional level to improve coordination across multiple local agencies. Logistically, it was identified a need for more health workers and resources such as ventilators, personal protective equipment, and hospital beds were required to face the pressure and widespread impact of a pandemic. Local resilience forums announced that they depended upon subject matter experts for more complicated aspects of pandemic response. Doubts were raised if this method was suitable in case of a fast-moving pandemic, since these experts would be called on to aid more than one strategic coordination group. On reflection, several of these action plans identified in these exercises later emerged as weaknesses in the UK response to COVID-19 in 2020, with the government being criticised for poor coordination, shortage of personal protection equipment in care homes and hospitals, continuing to allow people to enter the UK without being screened, and failing to launch a test and trace service until May 2020, more than 2 months after the peak of the first wave of the pandemic. Do any of these findings feel familiar to you? Understanding what's going on? High demand for limited services, a need for effective and central tactical coordination, management of communications and public perception, incomplete or out-of-date documentation, and reliance on a limited number of outsourced subject matter experts. I wish this was an in-person presentation, as I would now ask for a show of hands for the next 2 questions. Did anyone anticipate more than 2 years in their planning? And if you did, you were indeed prescient. Did anyone anticipate the anti-vax demonstrators and the level of pushback which we got from parts of our communities? There were, in fact, distant alarm bells ringing. Were we choosing not to listen? Let's move on to another topic, which has been in the news recently. Yes, this is another one that had to be on the list, climate. Okay, so let's reel off a few of the events around the world which have been laid at the door of climate change. Droughts, crop failures, flooding events in Europe, Australia and China, wildfires in Australia and America, tropical cyclones in Asia, tornadoes in America, and ice cap loss. The United Nations have recently published their climate reports. If you've had the opportunity to read it, and I recommend that you do, I think you would agree it makes pretty sobering reading. And to quote, widespread, pervasive impacts to ecosystems, people, settlements and infrastructure have resulted from observed increases in the frequency and intensity of climate and weather extremes. It seems we are indeed at an 11th hour moment for the Earth. Now, we could take up the rest of the day discussing this, but I'll focus on flooding as a broad example. Many of the world's cities are based either on a river or by the sea, and some both. Historically, this has been to facilitate trade and commerce. However, this now represents a substantial risk. Flooding losses exceed $10 billion in individual major flooding events. This is second only to earthquakes regarding to financial loss. Flooding risks emanating from both river and ocean flooding is increasing globally. So why is this? Well, global warming has increased the frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation. It's increased the intensity of tropical cyclones, which means those rated above 3 to 5 in their category, which can create storm surges. Urbanization has played its part, increasing mean and heavy precipitation over and downwind of cities. This has resulted in increased runoff intensity from areas which cannot absorb these increased rainfall, such as built-up areas, car parks, and roads. In coastal cities, the combination of more frequent extreme sea level events due to sea level rise and storm surge, combined with extreme rainfall and river flow events, will make flooding more probable. So what does this mean? Well, it breaks down into 4 different areas. Loss of lives and assets, risks to food security, and economic disruption due to the destruction of settlements and infrastructure. Loss of infrastructure and economic disruption due to floods, landslides, sea level rise, storm surges, and coastal erosion. This is sometimes known as compound flooding. Risk of degradation of marine, coastal, and terrestrial ecosystems, including loss of biodiversity. You may ask, why is this important? Well, it's because mangroves and coral reefs provide protection against coastal flooding. And just when you thought we had finished with the health issues, climate change comes along with its own severe health effects due to the increase of what are now called vector-borne diseases, such as dengue fever, yellow fever, West Nile fever, and Zika. Let's move on now to something which I believe we are all feeling. Energy. I imagine you're all painfully aware the cost of energy in all its forms has recently spiraled. This is impacting first world countries in the pockets of its population, but it is devastating third world countries with sudden and sustained shocks. Businesses can't dodge these increases. They are reliant on energy in one form or another to run their operation, from bakers to bankers, dentists to delivery companies. Whilst this current energy crisis is accelerating investment in renewable and alternative options for energy generation in countries which can afford these programs, and producing a drive to reduce dependence on fossil-based energy. However, these alternatives have a very long lead time. In the meantime, the likely immediate consequence are increased costs, business closures, financial stress, unemployment, and increased poverty. The legacy of this crisis is likely to be prolonged. Of course, on the flip side of this accelerated reduction in fossil fuel dependence is the impact on countries and communities whose economies are primarily based on extraction and sale of these commodities. History has shown these groups will struggle to realign their revenue streams, causing a realignment of the world economies. With our energy dependence and its vulnerability has sat unresolved for a number of years, we are now all feeling our dependence and our vulnerability amplified by recent events in Eastern Europe. This fits the disaster billing perfectly. Something we didn't expect, but could have anticipated, will take a long time to fix and be costly to do so. The challenges ahead are formidable. Let's now move on to some observations of our time. Cyber. If the last 2 years have shown us anything, it's an increased dependence we all have on IT-based services. From our streaming service subscriptions, our online purchasing addiction, and of course this, working from home. At the lowest level, there were local shops and restaurants which suddenly switched to being online cashless delivery operations seemingly overnight. Larger businesses had to deal with the challenges of wholesale change in operations with all or nearly all of its workforce working from home simultaneously. Whilst this switch is a credit to the teams involved that it was pulled off at all, it did present an opportunity for the more criminally inclined. Cyber attacks on our businesses and countries' infrastructure are undoubtedly on the increase. Originally, this was solely the territory of state-sponsored activity, and whilst they still do play a part in these attacks, it's no longer the sole domain of rogue states, but rather has become a dark web industry. You no longer need to be a script junkie. Attack tools are widely available as a purchasable service. On the dark web, with a stolen credit card or bitcoins, you can launch an attack by selecting what you want from a menu. DDoS as a service, ransomware as a service. Not only can single attacks be damaging, but cyber attacks are increasingly being used in a blended format, with one or more attacks being used as distractions whilst the attacker deploys another, more dangerous payload. Cyber attacks, more often than not, are visible to your customers, in many countries reportable to your regulators, disruptive, brand damaging, and like I said, worryingly on the increase. Now, more than ever, there is a need for increased scrutiny of the governance of our personal and business IT security practices, as they could just save the day. Shields up, as they say. Right, let's have another look at some recent newsworthy events in our supply chains. It's not news to say that catastrophic incidents can significantly disrupt your supply chains. But fortunately, pre-2020, most of these disruptions remained localized. And it was not until the onset of COVID-19 that disruption achieved a truly global magnitude. With governments around the world resorting to closing borders, shutting down manufacturing plants and imposing lockdowns to contain the virus, the effects of these measures became clearly visible in the global transport networks. We saw disruptions first clustered over Asia, and then these soon rippled along the main trade routes and served as a precursor to the disruptions in the broader economy. With widespread adoption of just-in-time production strategies, along with a global search for cost reductions by moving production operations around the world, means we have become increasingly sensitive to slowdowns or interruptions to delivery schedules. Chips used in vehicles, sea and land distribution networks, food distribution, commodity distribution, all impacted directly or indirectly. Full resumption of these transport networks post-COVID has been slow due to staffing shortages and vessels being held up in ports or in the wrong part of the world. The full effect of supply chain interruption cannot be underestimated. The blockage in the Suez Canal log-jammed over 400 vehicles, and over the 6 days that the Evergreen was stuck, cost approximately $54 billion in trade loss, which amounts to about 12% of global trade. Whilst this event did not result in any port closures, The downstream impacts meant container gateways in Europe and Southeast Asia, started to experience congestion due to the large number of simultaneously arriving vessels following the blockage. At the same time, empty containers were held for longer than usual at European ports, exacerbating the scarcity of containers at Asian export gateways and promoting ocean carriers to cut short port stays in Europe to quickly reposition equipment back to Asia. This exemplifies the connected and independent nature of our businesses, how long our supply chains are, and the need for your organization to fully understand them. Let's now look at how all these observations start to connect. There are several common elements to all of our observations. Firstly, most of them have an unexpected quotient, arriving at our door without warning or having unanticipated effects. The level of our readiness, shall we say, has been less than optimal. Many of these events have lasted longer than expected and had intensity which we've never seen before. For some, these events have happened simultaneously, compounding the pressures on an organisation and proving experiencing one disaster does not make you immune from other disasters. The impact of crises is larger and ranges wider than ever before. Recovery from these events has taken longer and cost more than anticipated. Remember that $10 billion per flooding event? Given the increase in frequency and intensity of some of these events, you may question, is this the new normal? The answer is quite possibly yes. So let's talk about how these ripple together and into our lives. As we've seen, with ever more interconnected world, the disruption of something far away and seemingly disconnected from your business may in fact be only a few degrees of separation away from you. I remember once hearing the phrase, the supplier of your supplier has to be known to you. Each of my observations I've spoken about have had downstream consequences from commodity shortages, staffing shortages, delivery delays, impacting construction, manufacturing, financial services, hospitality, sport, entertainment. The list goes on. As a current example, we are seeing how wheat production shortages have caused spiraling commodity price increases, with some countries unable to tolerate the increases and forcing them to use financial reserves to protect their citizens. The accompanying impact on employment has caused hardship for many. All this can impact on confidence in your brand or company and see competitive allegiances development, which may have a negative impact on your business. One thing leads to another, as they say. So let's now have a look at the consequences of these crises. With all types of disruption, there are consequences. Some immediate, some long-term, some expected, and definitely some not. With all disruptions, there is likely to be a period of instability, where what has happened is assessed and understood. This instability can breed nervousness in your customers, suppliers, or financiers. This is referred to as infection, and the medical analogy is quite apt. The actions and perceptions of businesses recovering from crises, regardless of the actual cause, may result in polarization of customers and suppliers. This can permanently damage a brand and take a long time to recover from. If you want to see a recent example of this, Google UK ferry strike and you will find the case in point. Crises can cause shortage of items or perversely oversupply, as was seen with the fuel in the height of the COVID pandemic. What tends to happen is an increase in poverty as the poorest individuals and countries struggle to adapt to rapid changes. Pressure on the least able to respond to the fallout of crisis can lead them to seek reparation against those perceived to have caused it. This can be directed at governments, businesses, or individuals. This can, in some situations, lead to civil unrest. This is why it's essential to learn fast from your incidents, improve your planning and your documentation, and to evaluate those best case and worst case scenarios as part of your planning and during your crisis response. Okay. I'm going to stop being Mr. Doom and Gloom now, and I'd like to share with you some new thinking for you to consider. Very early on in my career, I remember a good friend and business continuity mentor suggesting I should never die from a lack of imagination, meaning I should always consider how could this get worse, both in the thick of a crisis and when planning. Could you run out of raw products and components? Could you lose access to your premises for a long time? How will you avoid the loss of colleagues as they reassess their lives post-COVID? I think we have seen in all the observations I've chosen where potentially a little bit more imagination may have lessened the impact or duration of an event. However, let's consider some new methods of thinking. For all of us, I believe it should be our mission to have an organisation fit to effectively anticipate, adapt and respond to simultaneous threats, incidents and crises. To be able to learn fast and regenerate by developing a sustainable resilience capability, all of which would enable your organisation to continue to fulfil its purpose even during a disruption. Supporting this mission, I believe, are 5 values. Future ready. What do I mean by this? I mean your operation needs to be risk aware and have the flexibility required to adapt to unforeseen and unprecedented events. So work with your internal and external risk experts and ensure your planning is aligned with those risks. Enhanced readiness. This is all about intelligence-driven decision-making with the ability to rapidly understand a situation and mobilize the correct resources who are aware of their roles and responsibilities and whose skills have been developed through training and exercises. Exercising is by far the best way to highlight or focus on points which may need development in your planning and your preparation. Simultaneous events means having the skills, mindset, and surge capacity to respond to serious disruptive events in parallel. Ensure you have deputies for all of your crisis team members. Ensure they are fully trained. Ensure your crisis teams are manifestly ready to face the decision-making challenges of simultaneous events. Sustainable. Ensuring that all you do enhances your operations capability, is embedded, is repeatable, and with minimal effort, and then will endure over a protracted period. There is no point having a solution which will hold for 2 weeks if the crisis runs for 2 years. Again, having crisis reviews and having forward-thinking teams who can analyse what is happening and project those best and worst case scenarios. And finally, learning fast. This means quickly identifying the lessons learned following significant events. Transparently sharing critical information to enable better future decision-making. Strengthening documentation, using specialized tools to foster collaboration and centralize information, and develop your team's resilience competencies. Oh, a tall order, you say, Peter. How are we going to deliver this? Well, the answer is by being present in the process. You have the tools, the BIAs, the recovery plans, the crisis teams. Train your stakeholders regularly. Develop that muscle memory. Check your critical third parties and ask them to do the same. Ensure your planning is up to date and aligned with your risks. When planning, use your imagination. Consider with your business owners how bad situations could get and how long bad could last. Remember, don't die from that lack of imagination. Challenge your RTO and your RPOs. All too often, these are business wishes rather than realistic requirements. Test your business as usual resilience configurations. Is that network, computer, server, power really fault tolerant? Switch one side off and see what happens. Oh, bold, you might say, but better that you do it when you are in the driving seat than when the crisis is. Ensure your IT department is up to date with its patching, that it's successfully completing meaningful backups that deliver efficient restoration at scale if needed. And oh yeah, test them regularly. It seems that as every day goes by, we're identifying new threats and risks. Unfortunately, these do not replace the existing ones, but are added layer on layer on an ever-lengthening list. However, don't be deterred, as many of your existing processes and solutions will resolve many situations if they are implemented correctly, regularly reviewed and updated, and most of all, tested. There is a reason they drill and exercise pilots, emergency services, and the armed services regularly. It's so they are ready. Be more ready. And finally, it's later than you think. I've heard crises described as swift and brutal audits, and I believe we all have parts of our program which could do with improvement. Crises probe and challenge every defense that you have until they find a gap. This is a call to arms because it truly is later than you think. The next disaster which will rock your business is just around the corner, and it will no longer be a question of if, but when. And you know this. Make an effort, find your weak points and resolve them before some crisis finds them first. Challenge your assumptions. Confirm the response you expect is what you will get when an incident arises. Make sure your values are intact and in place. Be future ready. Enhance your readiness. Be ready for simultaneous events. Make sure your planning is sustainable and make sure you are ahead of the curve by learning fast. And finally, make sure you know everything about those distant lands so you don't get caught out. Thank you.